Good afternoon. I would invite you into a moment of prayer. O Lord, when the waters rage and foam, when the gift of creation overwhelms us, when our fears threaten to overtake us, speak your word to the wind and to the sea. Show us your care in the service of others. Make the joy of your peace overflow in our lives and fill us with hope. We come to you trusting in your mercy and knowing that your steadfast love endures forever. Look with mercy on those who were harmed or displaced by wind and water, especially in Asheville, Bat Cave, Chimney Rock, Fairview, Girton, Madison County, Marshall, the River Arts District, and Swannanoa. We remember especially those who died and the friends and family who grieve their absence. Give us all your strength, your peace, which surpasses all understanding, and renewed hope for restoration and rebuilding. Be with all who offer assistance, that they may be your hands and heart on earth. Let your love be known through those who work to bring order in the chaos. May your spirit uphold them. As you have made water a sign of your kingdom and of cleansing and rebirth, grant your people vision to see new life on the other side of disaster. Show us, we pray, how to respect the fragile balance of life. Guide by your wisdom those who have power to care for or to destroy the environment, that by the decisions we make, life may be cherished and a good and fruitful earth be preserved for future generations. To you be given all honor and praise in your holy name. Amen.
Good afternoon. My name's David Weintraub, and I run the Center for Cultural Preservation. Welcome to the Flood and Landslide Forum today. I'm so happy that you made it. Now, this is the point where I was supposed to show you this electrifying film, short film that was going to connect the 1916 flood, the Great Flood of 1916, with the Great Flood of 2024. However, given technology, it did not work today. And so I'm going to bring that back in a future program. I'm so happy that you're joining us today, whether you're here live or live stream. I want to first of all thank the Blue Ridge Community College for offering us this amazing space, WNCW Radio for being the program's media sponsor, and our collaborators, Conserving Carolina, the League of Women Voters, and a new organization that's focusing on stewardship here in Henderson County, the Henderson County Apple Country Mountain Keepers. You can find out more about these organizations and how to get involved by meeting them in the lobby at your tables once the program is over. Also, we have SBA in the lobby as well for small businesses who are looking for assistance, given Helene. Now, a word about the Center for Cultural Preservation. For the past 20 years, the center has become WNC's History and Documentary Center through running a Southern Appalachians oral history project that has collected about 500 oral histories among mountain elders throughout the region. We also produce documentary films about history, culture, nature, and the environment. And finally, we hold public programs that bring history to life. Of course, Mother Nature also brings history to life, and that's what brings us together this afternoon. Find out more about us at our table in the lobby. Although this program is free, organizing it is far from free. So please consider supporting our work by making a tax-deductible donation at saveculture.org or buying a DVD or 20 at our DVD table. So this is our plan for the forum today. The first half of the program will be a moderated discussion with our esteemed panelists. And speaking of our esteemed panelists, you can all come up to the stage right now. And they'll be discussing their expertise, their concerns, and as well as possible solutions that they would suggest. After that, the floor will be open for your questions. As you see, there's 2 mics in the aisles. And during the Q&A period, you can come up to the mic and ask your questions. We will try to also touch base with the folks on live stream as much as we can. And so you can post your questions in the chat there as well. To get started, we obviously are still processing the horrific storm that our region just experienced. As much as 30 inches of rain in just several days, at least 107 people dead, thousands homeless, and our land rearranged in ways that it's still hard to grasp. The media has called Helene unprecedented and unexpected. But those of us who study history, both the history of our geology, the history of our culture, and the history of our weather, understand that although the effects of Helene were unprecedented, we have seen several storms similar to Helene for hundreds of years. Much of the devastation today can be traced back to 2 things, in addition to the weather: substantially higher population levels than when the Great Flood of 1916 struck on July 16th, but also building in places that the Cherokee and the ancestors of this region knew was putting people in harm's way. And of course, I'm speaking of floodplains and ridgetops. While we can't change the weather, we can control how we build, where we build, and how we treat Mother Nature. If we do it right, we might be better prepared and better insulated from nature's wrath in the future. We can't move on until we recognize how we got here in the first place. Once we understand that Helene was more than just a bad weather event, more than nature just doing its thing, but a land-use tragedy that didn't need to happen, we can empower ourselves to take action. History, science, elder wisdom, and nature's wisdom can all play a role in helping us overcome and to heal. Let's go to our panel of experts. Rick Wooten, for over 40 years, has experience in applied geology in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, in the Piedmont, and in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Since 2003, his main focus was landslide hazard mapping and research, responding to landslide events in western North Carolina. Jim Fox has worked on building local resilience in western North Carolina for the past 20 years. Jim served as the director for UNC Asheville's National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center for 15 years, and was a founding partner of Fernleaf, a local company that delivers resilience decision support solutions. Jim is retired in 2024. I also might add that Rick Wooten is also retired. Jen Bauer, who's not retired. Jen Bauer, PG, is a principal geologist and co-owner of Appalachian Landslide Consultants in Asheville, North Carolina. She started ALC in December of 2011 after working with the North Carolina Geological Survey's Landslide Hazard Mapping Team since 2005. Chuck McGrady was the former president of the National Sierra Club, former NC State representative, and Henderson County commissioner. He currently sits on the Governor Josh Stein's transition team and serves on the NCDOT advisory board. And we have Chuck on the panel to focus on solutions and policy issues. Don Freeman is the sixth generation to live on his family's land. He is the pastor for Bear Wallow Baptist Church. His grandparents lived through the Great Flood of 1916, and he has lived through the floods of 1996, 2004, and 2024, among many others, I'm sure. Okay, let's start off with what people faced during Helene. And Don, you lived right there near Bat Cave at Chimney Rock in Girton, one of the hardest hit areas in this region. Tell me more about how Helene impacted your area.
When it actually hit, I slept through it by the grace of God, so I don't have the image of the wind and the rain. But as I got up that Friday morning, I looked out, and as I got out, I saw the devastation that had happened to the friends and families of there. And the roads were blocked. We were isolated for about 5 days. We could not get to Bat Cave. We could not get to Fairview. The roads were blocked. So on Saturday morning, I got up, got my backhoe and my dump truck out, and started trying to open the road so that people in the lower part of Girton could get back up and at least get to the fire department where supplies were being flown in. We had 7 Chinook helicopters, 4 Apache helicopters that landed there dropping off supplies that Samaritan's Purse were supplying. The military were flying them in. Samaritan's Purse was actually doing that. We actually lost 2 houses in Girton. One was a lady in her house, and a tree came down, knocked it off the foundation, and she was able to climb out through where the fireplace had been in the middle of the storm. The second house that was totally destroyed belongs to a single mother with 3 children, and fortunately she had left and gone somewhere else to a safe place so that if not, she could have probably been washed away also. But all the access roads, the bridges were taken out. There was, like I say, there's no way to Bat Cave or to Fairview. So we were devastated. And at that time, seeing the magnitude of the devastation, I was in deep depression. And then as the helicopters came in, I began to restore my faith in human nature, that there were people poured in from all over the country for the next few weeks and months to help us out. We had a group, EMS unit from Indiana came to send by our station. We had highway patrolmen from all over North Carolina. But our area was totally cut off from the outside world. Our power was out for 3 weeks and 16 hours. We had no communication by internet or anything, so we were isolated, and that was one of the times that I realized how vulnerable we really were to these natural disasters that happen.
Thank you, Don. Any other comments from panelists about the extent of the damage by Helene?
I can add a little bit. Sorry about that. Does this sound okay? Yes. Yeah, I think it's always heartening to hear how many people came together, whether they're government agencies, Samaritan's Purse, neighbors, to help everybody out here. So that, I think that's a very important point that Mr. Freeman makes. And I think one of the lessons that came out of the 1916 storm, that spirit, that neighbor helping neighbor, is still here. And because the weather pattern that we've seen over the last 20 years or so with extreme weather patterns, that these kind of events, hopefully not the magnitude of Helene, will probably happen again. Certainly, hopefully not the magnitude, but that spirit of cooperation and helping neighbors is going to be an important part of us pulling through these events.
I'll add to that as well. Fortunately, I live in Arden. I felt like I was on this, I didn't know I was on this little island of safety and security. My neighborhood was relatively recently built. We didn't have big trees falling. We never lost water. We only lost power from Thursday to Sunday. And then once we started being able to drive out and get internet, then I could start to see some of the things that had happened outside of our neighborhood. And We live up above the French Broad River, so I was able to walk down to it, and I got to see how high it was, so I knew things were bad in other places. Once we got back to having internet, that's when our company started getting phone calls in from people who needed us to come out and evaluate their landslides, evaluate their property to see if there was still something that could come down, was there a place that they could still be safe. And the things that broke my heart, still break my heart the most, were the ones where their homes had been destroyed, and we went up there and evaluated where the landslide had come from and had to tell them that we didn't feel like it was safe for them to rebuild there. And that's one of the things that still sits with me, and just that continued heaviness, I think, from the storm, that and we'll probably get into this, but we as geologists, we have some information, some models, the history to know where these things may happen again. And I'm sure we'll get into how we can hopefully use these tools as we move forward, as we decide where we do want to live, so that we can be aware of what the natural hazards are and how to protect ourselves from them, either before we move there or before the storm comes.
Thank you. All right, my next question. I think the general population believes that the Great Flood of 2024 was an aberration that never happened before or will happen again. What can you tell me about the topography, geology, weather patterns, et cetera, that makes this area unique and vulnerable to great floods and great landslides?
Okay, I'll jump into that. I think one thing that we've learned that history teaches us lessons. I'm not a flood expert. I spent a lot of my professional career working on landslides and trying to sort out the past landslide history of Western North Carolina. So regardless of whether we call Helene a 1,000-year storm or a 500-year storm or a 250-year storm, and yes, hopefully we won't experience that, but since 1916, of the past 108 years, we've had 3 storms that have generated thousands of landslides, and Helene is the latest. You know, the mid-July 1916 storm certainly triggered, thousands of landslides all up and down the Blue Ridge Escarpment in North Carolina, from Transylvania County to Allegheny County, much in the same places as the landslides and flooding in Helene. In the middle August storm of 1940, most of the damage was north of here, but just from our mapping, there were over 2,000 landslides just in Watauga County alone, and devastating flooding. Wilkesboro, North Wilkesboro on the Atlantic side of the Blue Ridge Escarpment, and then now we're looking at Helene. But in between those periods, there have been a number of storms that have generated hundreds of landslides. You probably remember Francis and Ivan. I think the rough tally from those 2 storms combined is somewhere around 400. So just to sum it up, over the last 108 years, we've had, 3 events that have produced thousands of landslides, 6 events, separate events, that have produced hundreds of landslides here in Western North Carolina. So over that period, we've had 9 events where we've had catastrophic flooding, fatal landslides, damaging landslides. So it's something that's happened in the past, and obviously we need to be prepared for in the future.
Well, I'll keep going on the landslide front. So I used to work for Rick when I was at in CGS. So I'll not repeat what he said, but one of the tools that we use is LiDAR topography, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but it's really high resolution data that can help us see what the ground looks like without the trees. And when we use this data, we can see old landslide scars that are there that give us a sense of where these things have happened before, and we can also see where they've ended up down in the valleys. We can see the landslide deposit just because we've honed our eyes to see, we've calibrated them by seeing what they look like on the LiDAR, and we go out into the fields, we look at them there. And so we know, we have a sense of what these things look like, and what we've seen by going out to look at these some of these Helene landslides is that they are either in the same place or very close or in the same drainages as landslides that have happened in the past. So we can see evidence of this happening over and over again. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that. I mean, if you look at the history of our area, as the European settlers started coming in, actually the storm that caused even more flooding than 1916 was 1791. And it was what then made the decision of people to locate the center of Asheville where it is instead of down along the rivers. And so these decisions about where we live, but also how we get between points, and this concept of mobility and restoring services is a recurring part about history. But we tend to have very short memories, and as more and more people keep living here, we have to face difficult decisions of where are those people going to live, and how are you going to get between those points. And so events like this, for us to be able to share that story and to share a greater understanding of this balance between flooding and landslides, and now unfortunately also wildfire, is a way that we can be making some better decisions moving ahead. But there's some excellent histories out there, and through events like this, it's also sharing the oral histories. So I think that's the important thing about families that have lived here forever, and kind of being able to share what has happened and what will happen again.
One of the things I've noticed in studying some of the history of these floods is the 1-2 punch, right? You have the big the precedenting rain event, and then you have the second event. And so when I saw all that rain that was coming down and a hurricane was waiting in the wings, I said, oh no, here we go again. It seems like history is teaching us about what the remnants of the Gulf and Atlantic hurricanes that reached WNC, it's trying to teach us something about that. What do you think that lesson mainly is?
Talk a little bit about that idea that in the landslide business, we call that the back-to-back storms. And that was a scenario, certainly in 1916. You know, the early part of July that year, there was a tropical cyclone that came in off the Gulf that I think in this area it probably dropped about 10 inches of rainfall. And so we don't know of any landslides that happened during that, but that was just basically the week before the mid-July 1916 storm came through. And so, you know, the ground was very moist, the rivers were already high, and so that the double punch has been going back, you know, going back as far as 1916, probably before that. Certainly it happened again in 1940. There was the mid-August 19 storm that affected Watauga County and further south, but in the latter part of that month in August, there was a very big storm that affected mainly Jackson, Haywood counties, Macon counties, and so some of those areas that shared the extent of both those storms, you know, got extra rainfall, and we saw it again in most recent times in Francis and Ivan. They were about a week apart, and so as David mentioned, that early rainfall before Helene actually hit is a scenario that it's very dangerous here in the mountains. And the other part of that weather pattern is, you probably remember 2013 was a record year of rainfall, and during that year there were a number of smaller storms that triggered landslides. So when we have these periods that are well above normal rainfall that extend for months or even a couple of years, when that moisture level is high, then small storms, you know, just convective summer thunderstorms or, you know, low pressure systems can trigger landslides. We saw that repeated again in 2018 when the rainfall record for 2013 was broken. So there were a number of storms during that period of 2018 to 2020. Not the huge hurricanes, thankfully, like Francis or Ivan or Helene, but certainly Alberto produced landslides. And so these periods where we have well above normal rainfall for months or even a couple of years, that's another dangerous scenario as well.
And we saw that with Fred as well a few years ago. I know there was several deaths in Polk County due to a landslide in that area.
One of the reasons that the rainfall is such a big issue is because it impacts the water that's flowing through the soil. That's really what it comes down to, is the water that's the soil is trying to hold. And we've seen so many examples in the Helene landslides as well as others in the past where springs play such a big role in the initiation of these. And we've seen some where you can see holes, that are a few inches in diameter where water must have been coming out of the slope, and that soil just could not hold that water anymore. And that's where the landslides initiate and let go of. And I've even heard stories from Helene. Someone saw a landslide had happened, and then after that he saw 3 feet of water shooting out of the ground from one of these what we call macro pores, or big holes in the ground. So the reason that this antecedent moisture plays such a large role is that the groundwater is just saturating that soil and just can't hold it anymore when that big rain event happens. Sure.
I just want to hear one, Jen.
Well, one of the things that here in western North Carolina that I've noticed living here, the biggest part of 78, 79 years, is we have such a watershed. And I agree that gathering all this information is great. But if it's not implemented, it's not any good. And I think that that's probably going to fall on the responsibility of the Corps of Engineers and on our local governments, that they don't permit people to build in places where there's going to be floods. They say this is a 1,000-year flood, but there's nothing to say that it won't happen next summer, again in the hurricane season. So if this information is not put into action by the Corps of Engineers and by our local government and permitting, letting people build next to streams, small streams, a stream that runs down through my horse pasture is about 3 foot wide and 1 foot deep. And on Friday morning, it was a raging river. And there was a road there that had over 3 foot of water in it. And it took over 126 cubic yards of dirt to fill it back in. So I think it falls on the Corps of Engineers. I think it falls on our local government that permit people to put them in a place where houses will slide off the mountains. And if they don't do that, then the information that's gathered is not going to be of any use.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. One of the things that a lot of folks may not realize is that when you pave the land, right, unpaved land in its natural state can absorb as much as 70% of stormwater. But once that's paved, whether that's parking lots or rooftops, driveways, you name it, that water is just going to flow, rush right off, and that it has particularly issues when you're up on the steep slopes, when the water is rushing down at a speed and quantity that those mountains weren't designed to handle. You want to talk some about those issues, about what happens when we replace natural land with land that's now paved, impervious surfaces.
Okay, you're entering into the territory of difficult decisions because we all love to live here in western North Carolina, and we like to have the services that support that. So we like to have a road coming to our house to allow us to get to work, take the kids to school. We also like to have places where we can shop and get food and other things. And the more of us that enjoy living here, the more of that's going to happen. And so this is getting down to some of the point that's already been made is we've got data, but then we've got to make decisions about how to implement that. And so, we talk about Corps of Engineers or elected officials, but it's really up to all of us to start thinking about, well, what's that right balance? How do we control the hazard, make this a safe place, but also make it a great place to live? So there's not easy decisions about the balance, but what David's talking about is this impervious surface and how water rushes off of that and where it goes. And so this is decision-making across scales. you know, the stories that we've heard of, you first look after yourself, and then neighbors come together, and then, you know, that decision space gets a little bit larger about, you know, your village or space around you, and then cities and counties, and then national. Well, how do you make all of those decisions and also put that in context of all the rest of the decisions we have to make about affordable housing, all the rest of the things that we expect out of, you know, our communities? And so, yes, it's important points, but how do we implement and how do we make those complex decisions? And so I think it's all of us working together with our elected officials to support and apply this information and get that right balance to occur. So I don't want to take any words out of Mr. McGrady's mouth, but I mean, you've been in a difficult position for having to balance this for years as an official.
Yeah, I mean, if it was easy, we would have already done it, but you know, on the local level, zoning and land use regulations are needed. We need to manage the intensity and type of development in flood-prone areas. We need to concentrate new development on higher ground. We need to enhance the effectiveness of our natural flood barriers, forests and wetlands, and redirecting development away from them. And finally, preserving open space. What we learned, I was, unfortunately, I guess, the guy that got tasked to try to address the hurricanes hitting the eastern North Carolina in 2016. And we had them for 5 in a row then. And we made the mistake in the first one, it was Matthew, of putting money in and rebuilding right where we were, not just putting it all back. And, you know, a year later, and 2 years later, and 3 years later, parts of what we put in place were washed away again. So it didn't make economic sense. And it made the case, though, for local officials and state officials that they needed to look at this in a different way. And so when we rebuild, and we're not going to be rebuilding everything back, there's just no way. You go down to Bat Cave right now, and that road is gone. I drove down through Bat Cave over to the Chimney Rock area, and frankly, I didn't even recognize parts of it. No. I mean, it's just, you couldn't build a road there if you wanted to, unless you're going to put it on stilts. So we got to do it a different way. I guess I'm optimistic because of what you said, Rick, in the beginning about how people work together. How long that'll last, I don't know, but I mean, neighbors got to know neighbors in this. You know, people that live right down the road were suddenly helping each other out. And if we can bring that spirit to the making these hard decisions, we can find ourselves in a better place.
Yeah, I think that that's just exactly the right answer. Difficult decisions, but looking at that balanced thing and all of us working together to get that balance to occur. I think we all have personal stories about how neighbors came together immediately afterwards, but it doesn't take long before you start thinking of the smaller differences that you have and start disagreeing instead of focusing on some of these critical things. You know, how do we make the right decisions to remain safe in this wonderful place that we have to live here in Western North Carolina? And so as long as we can keep focused on those main values that we have and staying focused on what's most important, then I would agree. And you gave a great list there.
And I think also including the science as part of that, those decision makers, including the geohazards people as part of that is important to just kind of tie it back to the data that we have.
It's got to be data-driven, and for a while there, we did away with what all of you did.
That's when I started Appalachian Landslide Consultants.
I know something about that. I wasn't there, but, you know, luckily we've gone back and figured out that we've got a basis on data. And I think that's clearly true.
Well, here in western North Carolina, we have such a watershed. If you look at all the mountains around us, in Girton, we had over 21 inches of rain that fell in over a 5-day period. So you look at the Bear Wallow, Little Pisgah, and all the mountains there, it all funnels downhill, and there's no really way you can control that. But the thing that I see is where clear cutting has been done on the mountaintops. There's nothing to hold the landslides back. There's nothing really for the water to go into, and that causes a major part of our flooding is clear cutting places that destroying the natural habitat. I've seen that not only in the flood, but I've seen it also in the wildlife, that the deer and bear have really no places to go in our area there because of all of the development's been put on the mountains.
Rick, you had mentioned to me a study that had been done about deforestation and landslides. You want to talk about that?
Yes, that's one of the things we looked at in our mapping in Watauga County. And you may ask, well, you know, how did you map over 2,000 landslides in something that happened in 1940 when we were mapping in 2008? Well, we were very fortunate. We had aerial photography that was taken just a couple of months after the August storm, and so all those debris flow tracks and stripes on the landslide showed up very, very distinctly, clearly, and you combine that with the LiDAR imagery that Jennifer talked about, you can really pin down on the ground surface where these happened. But one of the things we did in the Deep Gap area, you may know that's where 421 comes down over underneath the Blue Ridge Parkway and heads down to Wilkesboro. That's, you know, where Doc Watson and his family are from. There was a huge concentration of landslides there, about 600 or so in the 1940 storm. And so we thought, well, with this aerial photography, we can see where landslides started, where the area was forested. You know, there was a closed tree canopy, and we could see where they started, where there were no trees. And I was expecting, you know, more to have started where there were no trees, but there was roughly a five-fold increase in the numbers of landslides per square mile where there was no trees compared to trees. So the forests are an important part of what's, as Mr. Freeman said, what holding the hills together here. And both because they, when they're growing, they're taking up moisture, so that, like Jen said, when we get these heavy rains, but in the growing season, they're acting like pumps. So they're sort of pulling that moisture out of the ground. The roots actually help hold things together. And so we, not to go on and on, but we learned another lesson in the storm in 2020 in the Nantahala River Gorge. And you may remember, you know, after in 2016 and going into 2017, we had record droughts and record wildfires. And some of those, well, you know, the Party Rock Fire in Hickory Nut Gorge, but also the Farabee and Tellico fires in the National Forest in Nantahala Gorge. And those were large burns. And so when that storm came through in the Nantahala Gorge in 2020, with working with the Forest Service, all of those major debris flows, those debris flows that blocked the highway, that partially impounded the Nantahala River Gorge, that impacted the whitewater recreation the week before, you know, Labor Day, all those things. And not only that, you know, the Nantahala Reservoir upstream, because we were in a period above normal rainfall, when they got that heavy rainfall from the storm, they were in a position where they needed to release a lot of that lake water. So all those things sort of came together right there. Well, all those major debris flows started right in or right below where the most intense part of those wildfires were. So what I used to think, well, that's a problem that's happening out west where they have the mega drought followed by the atmospheric rivers. It's now happening in western North Carolina. So it's just to reemphasize the importance of healthy forests and helping hold the mountains together, but also just the kind of the weather roller coaster we're on right now is playing into that as well.
I think I'll add to that as well that a lot of I haven't done statistics on it yet, but a lot of the debris flows, the fast-moving landslides that we see that can travel thousands of feet down the slope, will hike up to the top of them, and several that we've seen have started at old forest roads. And it's either because of the loose soil that was on the edge of those roads, or perhaps there was stormwater drainage runoff that road was not meant to hold because of the storm. But I think remembering that when we are constructing our roads, even if it is for a logging operation, to reclaim those so that drainage can go back to its natural state, so there's not loose soil that's still up there, could help with preventing someone who's living downstream from getting impacted by a debris flow 20, 30, 40 years from now. And I know that takes a lot of forward thinking, but it's something that we're seeing now, so we can be aware of it when we are impacting the higher, steeper slopes.
Right. Just to add on that, I think one of the very positive things about living in this part of the world is the vegetation recovers very quickly. Every time I, go out and have to, prune and weed in the yard, I'm reminded of that. But so I think I don't want anyone to interpret what I said as, well, we shouldn't be doing wise timber harvest or doing it at all, but we can certainly do it in a way that minimizes the risk. And so if we cut the trees off and to get a better view, and that's different than wise and thoughtful timber harvest and regenerating the trees in that area, because there's a time window there. The trees are going to go back, but if so when we do those kinds of things, which are an important part of, renewable natural resources, like Jen says, there's some very simple things that can be done in reclaiming logging roads and paying attention to where we put culverts and drainages that can strike that balance between the wise use of resources and minimizing the potential hazards that can come from that.
Yeah, I just want to add the one other piece. We talk a lot about Helene and floods and Helene and landslides. But, most people I talk to, well, how did Helene impact you? And it was the wind damage from bringing down trees as well, too. Well, I think that this is one thing that we're going to have to consider as we're moving ahead for our solutions, that there were so many trees that came down during Helene that we're going to have to look at those areas where massive tree loss did occur, and how do we help Mother Nature repair itself more rapidly there too, because this is something that we didn't see as much in some of these previous storms sitting through here. So it's an additional point and pieces of data that we're going to have to take into account to start thinking about, okay, well, how do we keep that next storm from being quite as bad as well, too? So not to put another problem on the table, but it is certainly one that's there now.
Well, I think you point out, though, that just flooding and the effects of something like this are different in different places. Mm-hmm. And so we've been talking about slopes and landslides. That's not the issue at the south end of Hendersonville. Right. That's a different issue completely. Yeah. Yes. And in large part caused by man-made structures and things that blocked the water flow and pooled it and let it, spread it out across a much larger area than might otherwise be affected. So we gotta recognize that, it's not one form of flooding here. There are several. I have a theory about the tree loss. You can look at it on I-26 on the other side of like Clear Creek and Howard Gap, and you'll see that a big subdivision has come in, and they took a lot of trees out, and ironically, or maybe not ironically, expectedly, when the wind hit that little bit that was left, they didn't have their peers standing right next to them anymore, and they lost a lot more than you would have expected if it had been, at least kept in a more forested state, probably.
Behind you is a picture of the 1961 flood. This is at the corner of Spartanburg Highway and Greenville Highway, where we have Fresh Market. We used to have Fresh Market, Publix, and a number of other things. As you can see, this is kind of what happens in south side of Hendersonville, and we've just built all these essentially dams right on top of all that. I'd like to kind of move.
When you build on a swamp, I mean, what are you going to get?
Right.
Those lands, the soils there haven't changed their nature. They're still wetlands to a large extent, and yet how many permits have been sought over the last year or two to build in that very place? And those go back to the hard decisions that need to be made.
Yeah, so I want to dive into some of the land policies that have affected Helene's impact on us, as well as land policies that can be more proactive for the future. Me and Rick Wooten did a dog and pony show throughout the region several years back to educate the public, to educate first responders and others about landslide issues. And this slide was particularly fascinating to me because I knew we lived in a landslide-prone area, but what I didn't realize was how much of the human factor was precipitating these landslides. Can we make sure that our phones are off? Because we're trying to record this, and I keep getting these bells ringing. 73% of the landslides we've had in the last, I think it was 94 years, not including Helene, were on modified slopes. And this was, and I think I saw the slides you created for several other counties, and it was pretty much within that parameter, 73, 74%. So I'd love to have you speak to that.
Yeah, again, and I guess the first thing is to maybe clarify what we mean by modified slopes and the terminology we were using. By modified, we mean where there's been ground disturbing activity, roads, house pads, those kind of things where, we've changed the shape of the land and how water flows through that land. And so typically when a modified, what we call a modified slope fails, it's the excavation or the cut slope for a road or the fill material that's placed on the downhill side of that road. When you're making a road, you cut a notch into a hillside and you take material here, then you have to put it somewhere. So a lot of times it goes on the downhill side. And that's all very well and good because that can be done in a well-engineered and well-maintained way. And so typically, a lot of roads in the mountains, some of them perform much better than others, and a lot of times that goes back to the original design, how well it matched the landscape, and how well it's maintained afterwards. And so I think this is getting to the long-range point of view. We can build a well-designed road and well-engineered, but that means everything has a design life. So that road, the culverts, the ditches, if they're not maintained in a way that puts the water in a safe place, that's going to lead to problems in the future. So that is something we can have control over, is where roads go, how they're built, because there's obviously a need for roads in the mountains where people have a place to live. There's some places that are better suited for roads than others. And so that's part, I think, of the looking ahead in how and where we rebuild and taking the long view, beyond our lifetimes, so that if we do the same things the same way in the same places that have problems, we're setting up future generations to experience some of the pain and anguish and problems that we are. So I think, to get slightly philosophical here, there's a Native American saying that we don't inherit the land from our ancestors, but we borrow it from our children. And so I think in keeping that community view and that taking the long view and working together with those ideas, then we can certainly make a lot of improvements and reduce the amount of pain and cost that we have endured time and time again in these events. That was a little long-winded answer to your question.
No, it was great. So I want to get to our policy guru there, Chuck McGrady. Want to speak to some of the land policies you think have exacerbated the devastation from Helene, and what steps can we move forward to better insulate ourselves?
I try to stay upbeat. That's sometimes hard dealing with who we elect. But, I mean, flooding has a lot of small things that can happen that people can do in their own backyard, and what they are building, rain gardens and permeable pavement and that such sort of things. Then there's, the nonprofit community. Conserving Carolina, acquired a sod farm out on 191 and turned it back into a place where water can flow, and it creates a reservoir. We right now, all parts of government are talking a lot about building resilience into future public construction. In Hendersonville, they've got the Above the Mud program going on, which is a sort of a trails thing, but it's also a resilience thing. And that's positive. I mean, it wouldn't have, 10 years ago, they wouldn't have been talking about this issue. And the fact that government now, as it's looking to do things that it ordinarily has to do, is beginning to talk about the issues, I see as a real good thing. But there's more to be done. I mentioned South Henderson County, Hendersonville particularly. I mean, one of the biggest problems there is a certain parking lot in front of the Fresh Market. Who ever heard of sending all the water coming through to get to the other end of the parking lot? That thing just backs right up. It's in a huge cement impediment, which takes the water and then spreads it out all over the place because the water can't go where the water wants to go. There's discussions occurring now about coming in and changing that. Of course, it takes money, but it would be something we need to be about. If you're from Henderson County, last year we were going through a comprehensive plan, and at every point, almost, the county sort of backed away. And in fact, they even weakened the limited floodplain protection ordinance they had in place. But the upside there was that an election occurred. And sometimes, I know I'm on a nonprofit panel, but sometimes you just got to change people out. And the people of Henderson County did. 2 of the 3 votes were up for election, and they're no longer county commissioners. And hopefully we'll see something good out of the county in the coming year. I think there's now the votes, but there's an impediment that I suspect most of the room doesn't know about here. Late in the legislative session in December, you've heard about this bill that was about disaster relief, but had, clipping the wings of the governor and the attorney general and moving responsibility for the election board. It's a 131-page bill. Go to the last page. It's a killer for land use. Don't ask me how when you get to the end of a legislative session and there's only one bill left to go, it's like a Christmas tree. It attracts little baubles, shiny things. And the last page of that bill has a provision which basically prohibits local governments from doing rezonings or text amendments that decrease the permitted density of development or reduce the range or permitted uses of the property. Meaning, you can't tighten things up. And so if you met with a county commissioner today, or you met with the mayor of Mills River, or for that matter, any local official, and you wanted to talk to them about how they're going to tighten up their zoning ordinance, right now, they can't do it. Now, the legislature says they made a mistake. They didn't realize it was in the bill. Well, I get that, because it's a 131-page bill, and it came out one day, and they passed it the next day. Bad, bad, bad. And right after Helene, and the state is spending a lot of money to work on this issue. At the same time they're doing that, they do something that cripples the ability of local government to do what it ought to be about. So that's the impediment near term. This will go away probably. And then the next impediment will be that people will start forgetting. Right now, I mean, everybody's on the same page. It's sort of surprising. Republicans and Democrats are talking to each other about this issue. But my fear is that a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, if we don't get moving rather quickly, housing issues and these sort of things just take a long time to solve, but that people will forget. There just won't be the same, urgency and force behind it. New people will move in, and they weren't here during this. We'll start talking about this in terms of the past, when it's still probably the present. So,
And
probably longer than you wanted, David. But
No, not at all. And those signs, those real estate signs will be back up in Bat Cave and Chimney Rock in the River Arts District in a few months again, and or we cannot let them. It's up to us. Can you speak to some of the buyback issues? I know putting people in harm's way is part of the issue that I want to explore here in the forum, and we talked about this balance between low-income housing and protecting the natural resources. But I think what tends to happen is these policies become de facto policies. We're not necessarily intending to have trailer parks on the banks of the Swananoa, but that's what we had, and that's where many deaths occurred, and so much destruction occurred. So the buyback programs, at least were intended to make sure that we're not building back in those places and that people are fairly compensated. Do you want to speak to some of that?
Well, we had a flood damage reduction task force after the 2004 floods. And, one of the main recommendations was areas along the Swananoa that got wiped out were trailer parks and everything, and don't put the trailer parks back. And Chuck said, memory is short. That worked for about 5 years. And sure enough, they didn't put the trailer park back, but they allowed manufactured homes sitting on cinder blocks to go into that same area. It's kind of good intentions, but there's ways to get around that and then shorten memory. But I think another point that Chuck made was, one solution works in one area, it doesn't work in others. That you have to look at kind of what's going on and figure out the best solution for that area. And so how do you do that? Well, you've got a lot of data, you've got a lot of things, but we, working together, need to be a lot more aware of what those things are. And then we do have the power of our voice. And so, again, the recent election in Henderson County showed the power of people saying, no, this is not right for what we've got to do. But there's got to be a lot more of us that are aware of what those balances and trade-offs are. So how do we get information from these wonderful experts that are sitting on either side of me and a lot of other people into a lot more of our hands? And this is really what the shortfall is and what we're trying to do here in events today. How do we do a better job of getting us to be aware of this complicated issue that we're dealing with and work together to figure out these place-specific solutions that are going to keep working for us? So I don't necessarily have an answer for you for your one question, but it's complicated, but more of us understanding the complications and those trade-offs really helps that situation for us being able to work together.
The City of Brevard, after 2004, adopted an ordinance that requires a developer to complete a no adverse impact certification relating to flooding. That is something that cities could do. It's been upheld and isn't. It goes back to the data issue. I mean, that somebody actually looks at what the impacts before they're going to sign this thing. I would note, though, that, you know, that sometimes we just have different. I mean, we built a bank right outside of the Fresh Market along, you know, what used to be the 25 going south, but right there, and they made it much higher, and that seemed like a good thing to do. They do it on the coast all the time. Of course, that's coastal flooding, which is very different than mountain flooding. But then, you know, we've had Publix come in, and, you know, everybody loves Publix, I guess, but, you know, they took a really big slot of land and built it up. Where did all that water go?
Right.
Neighborhood properties.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, it was slow-moving water, actually. There's no slope over there to speak of, but it just spread out, and spread out, you know, Arkwood, and I just think we've got to come back and at each point figure out the unique way to deal with the flooding issue depending upon the topography and depending on what it is we know. And I'm hoping, and I'm hopeful right now that, you know, there's a willingness to go there. But as I expressed, I'm not sure how long that willingness will be. We'll change out, you know, county commissioners and legislators, and they'll forget the experience a bit.
In the city of Charlotte, they have an ordinance there that when you put up a large building, you have to have enough drainage from that roof, whatever it is, however square feet it is, to accommodate that, because they realize with all the concrete, asphalt, and the roofing, that there's nowhere for the water to go. So that you have to have a plan in place in advance, not after the flood, but in advance, that you know that that area can contain that water. So if you don't do that, I mean, if you cover everything with asphalt and concrete, the water has nowhere to go. So you've got to that's one of the things that has to be part of the pre-planning, is not if it's going to happen again, it could happen next year. How are you going to control the water off this asphalt, concrete, and roofs? I mean, that's something you have to come up with beforehand. You don't go out to plant a garden in the wintertime. You pre-plan to plant a garden in the spring of the year. So the same way it's got to be done in the planning board of our county, of our state, to decide how we're going to manage the runoff from all of the covering that the water can't penetrate. That has to be done. If you don't, you're going to have floods, just like the south end of Hendersonville does.
Cary prohibits new lots and new development in the floodplains along certain distances from whatever that water is.
Right.
And given where you're from, it's going to be very difficult to come back in and put in new houses somewhere
Right.
along whatever road ends up through there.
Right, exactly.
I want to start taking questions from the audience. If people have questions they'd like the panelists to answer, you can come up to the microphones in either aisle. I have plenty of questions I can ask, but I'd love to hear from you guys.
I have a few questions about it. First of all, I'd like to know, is there a consortium of groups with expertise that are working on this to approach our county commissioners and put in place safeguards and higher standards when it comes to storm drainage and hazardous slopes? And so that's my first question. Do you know if there's any
Let's
kind
go
of...
one at a time, because our memory is short, too. The first question, what I'd suggest is try to figure out what the data is. And there is a national organization, the American Flood Coalition, which, if you go on their website, has got a massive number of a lot of information about what different places are doing with similar sorts of problems. And so just look, type in American Flood Coalition. They've got a book on there called Adaptation for All, How to Build Flood Resilience of Every Size. And that's really key. I mean, what will work in Bat Cave and Girton is not what we've got in Hendersonville, and Asheville's got something bigger.
Right.
And so you've got to go that way. But my belief is that all action needs to be local, and I would just recommend you talk to some of the organizations that are out here or about to form out here. If you're looking locally, find a local organization. They'll be the best thing probably to keep the subject before public policymakers.
In terms of Henderson County,
No, I'm just talking in terms of all the local counties,
right.
and because I'm a retired civil engineer, and I'm concerned about the storm drainage requirements. Don made a good point, saying Charlotte, new buildings, you got to retain all your drainage on site. Here what you will hear in public hearings from developers, attorneys, or engineers is that, our post-development runoff won't exceed the pre-development runoff, okay? Quote unquote, because we have to retain, a certain amount on site. Well, that sounds good if you're a member of the public that goes, well, they're not going to create any more runoff. But the reality is, my understanding, that design criteria is based on a one-year storm. So it's only true one out of the next 100 years. And so those are things, that's just a basic thing. And we had a project over in Reynolds area off of 74A 2 years ago, 550 multifamily units. And that's what we heard. It drains directly into Cassius Creek, 5 miles down. It's at Biltmore Village. So, totally untrue statement, but the design criteria, that's the state's mitigation, that's what we have to do, that's the state. But it's when it's presented, it's not presented that way.
I think
So that's why I'm looking for, like a coalition individually. I mean, I'm not going to be able to do anything. I'm not connected. I don't know the players.
So there is a couple different things. Number one, the American Flood Coalition site is an excellent one. That's a great point of information. Locally here, our Council of Governments, Land of Sky, covers the 5 counties in the French Broad watershed.
Okay.
They have a study going on, and all the counties and municipalities are participating. They're looking at best practices, in other words, pulling in things like the American Flood Coalition, But the state also, if you go onto their website, the state has a multi-hazard resilience plan, and there is a database on there of all the best types of options to be looking at these different hazards that you can go on to as well. The problem with this is, again, how do you get all this information, this great stuff, and get it into that very local problem that you're talking about, that local ordinance, to get that to work? And I think it's just, again, presenting, well, why is it different in Henderson County if the town of Brevard got it to work really well, or Buncombe County has a stronger steep slope ordinance? It's that power of the neighbors and everything, and we all share the watershed. That's the basic point here that we're all agreeing on, right? That as we make decisions in one part, it's going to impact our neighbors. And that is always that key point that you're talking about here with your question, is how does it impact the neighbors? It's not just that local development, but the people downstream and all of it as well too. Or with landslides, that road that's cutting across and impacting the people down below the landslides. So no perfect answers, but there are groups that are working for that communication. So check out Land of Sky, check out the American Flood Coalition, check out the state resilience.
I don't have much faith in the state or a state organization. I mean, I think it's got to be a local organization doing local lobbying and information to the local officials.
Well, then that's what Chuck said, these excellent nonprofits that are
The
represented. and are out
Apple,
there as
Apple
well, too.
Country Mountain Keepers, the organization, it's new, but the people involved in it often have been advocates here for a long time. So organizations like that, who are advocates for the mountains in each community, those are the key points, I think, to stand up to making sure that policymakers understand that the people of concern are not just the developers, but the people who live here and the habitats that exist here. I want to move on to other questioners, and then we can come back to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I think you made two really excellent points that really stood out for me. One was the fact that each flood, each hurricane, each disaster is unique based on the local geography, the local topography. All factors are very unique, and they have to be taken, all those local factors have to be taken into consideration. The other is the importance of social memory. What a lot of people talk about is how we as a society can bridge the memory of this event, this disaster, and pass that on down to the next generation. One example where the local conditions was taken into consideration and preserved and helped preserve the social memory was in Rapid City, South Dakota, where they had a major flood in 1972. A dam burst, the major rainstorm up in the Black Hills, a dam burst, flooded much of the floodplain in Rapid City. The city council chose to exclude development in the floodplain, and they maintain that to this day. They, after many, many attempts to encroach on the floodplain, which was prime real estate, they bought out houses, they bought out businesses, and they preserved that. And they named that area, they made it a riverfront park called the Memorial Park as a memory to those who perished in that 1972 flood. So my question is, how do we go about not just retaining the data and the after-action reports and the plans for the future, but maintaining social awareness of this problem? How do we sustain the memory to augment the more formal plans and procedures?
That's a question I don't want to answer, but, because if I knew the answer to that, I think it would be much easier to keep policymakers on track. Unfortunately, so much public policy usually gets made immediately after something goes wrong. And what you described in South Dakota, people don't recognize could have been here. If the dam in Lake Lure had given way, that is a dam. The road goes over it. You know what's under it? The sewage system. And if that had released, and there were concerns regarding that dam and others. We would have had even more lives lost and destruction. It held, but will it hold next time? I don't know. Anyway, I appreciate I'm going to go back and look at the example you quoted. I'm not familiar with it enough.
I'll speak a little to it. I think the answer is in your question. You've already said if we memorialize it in policy, then it's written so that whoever comes next just says, oh, this is how it is done. But if that right now sounds like this is not an option, I suppose we can talk to our state representatives about changing that, not being an option. And we can also help to increase awareness, because that's where it comes down to individual responsibility, understanding the hazards that we're potentially encountering. And so one of the things that we try to do is touch people who are coming in who might not be familiar with the history of the area, and we do that through working with the real estate community, because we found that a lot of folks, that's their first local person that they really talk to and try and get an understanding of the land or the area. And so we've done a lot of outreach to real estate brokerages just to try and help them understand landslides as a hazard, what to look out for, how to use the landslide hazard maps that are available. And then we offer property evaluations for people who are perhaps purchasing steep slopes or concerned about it, but really just educating people about this is something you should look into. If you want to live on a steep land or a downslope of steep land, and I'm speaking only of the landslide hazard, not the floodplain, but becoming aware of the hazard in general and the data that is out there is something that we can do while we're waiting for the policies to catch up.
Yeah, and some of the real estate companies have gone that next step further. They actually have put riders in theirs. They won't list your property unless there is some of the warning of, oh, you know, this property sits at this place compared to a floodplain or landslides and things like that. So there is ways that you can get to that. I think the other part of answering the question was the power of things like conservation easements, that if you can put some of this land into conservation easements, then it's going to keep the future part going. And so it certainly worked very well around our neighborhood. We've put some things into conservation easement in areas that flood all the time. And a future development coming in has not been able to build in that conservation easement to be able to keep that memorialized. So there are some tools that are out there that we can be taking into effect.
You're going to see more of that with the FEMA funds coming in. If the landowners and the governments pull them down, they're going to be buying out a lot of land, and that land is going to be coming back eventually to local government. Now that creates a problem for like DOT, because they now have a conservation easement that was set up by the federal government.
Right.
I don't know where they're going to put the roads, but that's still a work in progress. But
Right.
There's a real opportunity right now because there's so much money available to do things that we recently haven't been able to find any money to do.
That was one of the success stories I heard from Conserving Carolina, that some of their conservation easements collected millions and millions of gallons of flood water during the storm, water that would have gone and caused havoc elsewhere if not for those conservation easements. So
That's among them is that's the sod farm right at 191 and the river, Mills River, a huge impoundment or stoppage of floodwaters. Even though we had so much water, you couldn't tell.
I wanted to segue into a live stream question we had. FEMA is supposed to update the flood maps every 5 years, and the questioner said they don't think they're doing that, and so I wondered if you guys could speak to that. When are they going to update flood maps so they're realistic?
I can just give you some history. The floodplain maps were updated along the Swannanoa after the 2004 floods, about 3 years after that. But I think that that's the last time those floodplain maps were updated. Hopefully we can get the floodplain maps everywhere that was impacted by Helene updated. And we are getting the maps of the landslide locations officially put in place as well too. So that's a big step forward sitting through there as well too. So there is progress on that. We just have to make sure that people are looking at those maps and making the right decisions off of them as well too.
It's a little bit related topic, but I just wanted to point out, just follow up on the point that Jim made, that there is progress being made. And I know after Francis and Ivan, there was a big program to update and reconstruct the emergency spillway at the North Fork Reservoir. And because there were problems with that in Francis and Ivan, and I'm pretty confident that work helped, prevent that particular dam from failing, and which would have made the flooding in the Swannanoa even worse. So there are little incremental pieces of progress and good things, but obviously, as everyone's pointed out, the time is right now to make your views known and incorporate this data and speak with local governments and regional governments and pass it along to your children. So that they know the stories and they can pass it on to their kids and their kids.
That's a really good question, the floodplain maps. I promise to find out and post it. Send it to you, David.
Okay.
I think that
Sorry.
there is supposed to be new LiDAR flow, new LiDAR data collected sometime, and maybe it already has, I don't know, sometime early this year. I don't know if the floodplain maps will be based on that or if they'll use that as a base map for them, but that would make sense. Could you ask about that too?
Yeah, I'm guessing we got a lot of data about floods right now and how far they got. I have a suspicion that these numbers are going to change. The 1,000-year flood is now going to be the 250-year flood or the 100-year flood, and it's going to affect insurance rates. I mean, it's going to be financially impactful. In a number of ways. And it will empower local activists to be able to come in and say, why are you building here? It's a really good question. I'll try to get it answered.
I guess a related question before we get to the questions over there. So we know we have, if your property is in a flood zone, right, the seller has to notify you and you have to get flood insurance, blah, 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 blah. Number one, you know what the question is going to be. Why doesn't that apply to landslides? And two, how do we make it?
I think the question about why does that not apply to landslides is because there's more uncertainty with the landslides. We have ideas, or we have models that are showing where these debris flows may start that are based on similar topographic conditions to where we know other ones have started. But we don't know where the rain will happen. And we really need the rain to trigger where those landslides may happen. So with the flood case, we know every time it rains really hard, this is where the floods will happen. We don't know if it rains really hard, where will the landslides happen? So there's still a little uncertainty in that. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't use them as a guide to where do we not want to be downslope of. And I'm speaking particularly about the debris flow style landslides, again, the ones that often start in the hollows up near the top of the ridges, in the concave catchments where water's collecting. That's where they will typically start, on the steep slopes, and then they'll start flowing and then picking up more and more soil and rock and trees as they go down to where they, in some cases, scour all the way down to the bedrock. And then when they get to the valley bottom, that's when they spread out, and then that's where people are living. That's where they have killed people during Helene. And so there's also trying to model that if it starts here, where would it impact down here? So there's still some uncertainty in that too. We don't know exactly how wide it might spread out or that kind of thing, how far it might go. And the models are getting better and better, but we could be more aware of there are hazards modeled upslope of us, so let's not be right next to the stream down at the base of that valley.
But a seller is supposed to advise a buyer about anything that is a material fact that affects the property. Would you want to know if you bought a home on a slope that there'd been debris flows above over the last 50 years?
Yes, I would. Yeah, just emphasize a little bit what Jennifer's saying is, I wish the landslide science and forecasting was as easy as the flood forecasting is, as difficult that is, because, there are a lot of variables here. But I think if we try to narrow it down to the essential things, that the deadliest form of landslides, which we call debris flows, but you hear in the news as mudslides and mud flows, they're typically going to follow drainage ways along the creeks that come off of the steep mountainsides. So, a very simple thing to do to sort of improve the likelihood of you not being impacted by these is, give that mountain stream that's full of big rocks, these big rocks in the stream are telling you something. They didn't come down in the little trickling brook. They were moved by some very powerful water. Give those streams an area of respect. Step back, at least, 30 feet at a minimum, and so that's one way, whether we call it debris flows or a flash flood, which, these drainages are prone to, that's a very straightforward and relatively simple way to help improve your safety in these mountainsides. And the other reason we map these areas where ancient landslides deposits are is, like Jen said earlier, that's where the modern ones tend to go. The well-behaved debris flows follow the stream channels, but there are some bad actors out there in these extreme events that actually flow out on the top of these old, what we call fan deposits at the bottom of the hill. So I think being aware of where you build and how you build by paying attention to what the ground looks like. If there's big piles of boulders out there, that's probably from something that happened sometime in the past that really had a lot of moving power. A good chance those were debris flows.
And I'd like to clarify something. So North Carolina, the sellers don't have to disclose anything. North Carolina is a buyer beware state, but if there is a landslide, it is a material fact, the real estate agents have to disclose them. So that's another reason for real estate agents to make themselves aware of what is going on so that they can be as transparent as possible about what has happened on that property so they don't get themselves in trouble. And we've seen that happen as well. So that's another reason we try and reach out to help these real estate agents so that they are just pass-throughs of information, just letting people know what is there already, and then the clients can make their decisions about it.
Thank you for that clarification. Okay.
Sorry, I've got a little more of a rant than a question. Now, the education system, we've got to learn math, we've got to learn English, we've got to learn history. Well, you also have sex education. Why have we not got local history to be taught in our schools? I come to this school when I was 47 years old because I got laid off of a job to get trained for a new job. Well, I had required English class I had to take to do auto body. Now, where am I going to use that English fixing a fender on your car? Why can't we have an educational system to teach people about our local history and about the things that's happened and teach and pass this stuff forward? Look at the audience you got here. Most of us are elderly people. Somehow, we got to get the younger generations involved in our community. And when I was growing up, it took a community to raise a child. Back then, everybody played outside. You run around everywhere. Well, neighbors knowed neighbors. If your child was doing something wrong, before he got home, his mom and dad knowed about it. We've lost all of that. We've lost the heart in our community. I've just come back from Australia, and I stayed at a town of 350 people in the town. Before I left, I stayed there a little over 3 months, right at 3 months. They was having a little get-together, and I stood up in front of the whole community to tell them what kind of heart they had, because we're losing this in the world today. And if people don't start interacting and meeting people, most people don't know 2 or 3 of their neighbors. Sometimes, you got to make a point to go meet your neighbor. You may not like him, but you'll know to watch out for him when you see him come down the street. But excuse my French, but when the shit goes down, you'll know who you can count on and who you can't. So my question is, why can't we see about getting this in the educational system and teach our kids and help future generations to watch after the land? That's what we're here for, is to watch after our stewardhood. And if I've offended anybody, I'm sorry, but I just...
No, I think you make a great point. And in fact, after the 2004 floods, there were some programs from some local nonprofits and education that went out into the schools and educated them as well too. And I don't know now, it's been a long time since Mike had went through school, but there are these standards of education, the points it's supposed to be taught in schools. And certainly the teachers then ask for these nonprofits and groups to come in and provide that education about the flooding into the schools to meet that as well too. I don't know how long that lasted after the 2004 floods. Probably this length of memory and other things became important. But you do bring up a great point.
Well, I'll tell you, I've got one of the largest probably owned photo collections of Henderson County, and David will tell you. Well, I used to go to middle schools and primary schools and put on photos display and explain what they were there. Well, it wasn't nothing really gross, but butchering a hog, they had to hang the hog. It was before it was skinned or anything. And several people got offended because I showed the children how life used to be. Well, they stopped me from coming to the schools because I was showing them things that they thought offended the kids. Well, people need to know this. They need to know where their food comes from, just like what's going to happen to the mountains if you clear cut it. We got to stand up somewhere, somehow, some way.
I really appreciate your question, and
Obviously, a lot of people do.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and this is something I was going to bring up as a response earlier, but didn't end up doing it. But I think part of that awareness is including earth science as part of our curriculum. And I know there are some schools that do have that, but maybe bringing in the stories and the people and the local knowledge, like he was talking about, could really make those stories stick. I know I've done some kind of, I guess, career day type things where I've brought in a pile of sand and then had students put their houses on it, and then we had buckets with holes in the bottom, and we made it rain, and we talked about what happened to your house, where did it go, what did it get hit, just to give them a sense of oh, where I put my house is really important. You know, the kids that put their houses on the rock, they were okay. But I agree, some kind of basic earth science that everyone takes would maybe help out. I don't know.
Yeah, Jen, Paul, I think your point is very well taken. In my mind, Helene showed us that history doesn't just give us context to our lives, but it could save our lives. And one of the things that I've learned in the 500 oral histories that I've done here is how resilient people were. You know, July 16th, 1916, everyone's food was in the ground. It wasn't in Walmart. It wasn't at Publix. It was in the ground, and that washed away. And yet people survived. They helped each other. They had, people had canned goods. They had a smokehouse if it survived the flood. 2 days after Helene, everyone's running to Ingalls, interfering with the first responders to be able to save people's lives and people's homes, because nobody had anything in their house. And so that history, I think, is essential. Time is really short. We only have a few more minutes in this venue, so unfortunately we have to wrap this up. Additional questioners, you can come on stage and ask the panelists your question. Live streamers, you're welcome to email me your questions and we'll pass it to the panelists. I appreciate your time and your effort, your knowledge, your expertise. I appreciate you all coming out. This is the beginning of a conversation. This is not the be-all and end-all. We have to continue this. We have to make sure that our memories are not short and that we find ways to work together, because as everyone has said, the notion of the mountains here is the notion of stewardship, is people helping people, people being there for each other, not just staring at their screens, whether they're 5-inch screens or 55-inch screens, connecting with each other. And sometimes it's the old guy or gal down the block who's been here for 8 generations, who might be a little crotchety, who might be the fountain of information that could save your life and could build some community resilience. And to me, that's one of the most important lessons that Helene has taught me. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all.
David, I know we're running short on time. The question regarding FEMA and the flood maps, I work as a floodplain administrator here locally. I did want to update Mr. McGrady. I know you're a very busy man. So FEMA is behind schedule, but they are releasing preliminary maps for Henderson County in the fall of this year, but that data is based on information that was collected in 2015. They are not going to be incorporating the new LiDAR into that.
It's always
Gotcha.
back, but better than nothing.
Yeah, it's better than the current maps that exist.
Correct, yeah. So it will take into account new rainfall data and things like that.
In October of 2024.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the discussion.
I was pretty sure they weren't updated. They're not. Yeah. It takes a while.
Yeah. It's good to see.
Yeah, I feel like this is